In 1509, England crowned a teenager who seemed almost too good to be true. He was tall, athletic, and fluent in several languages. He was a musician, a scholar, and a genuine romantic. The crowds adored him. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in disbelief that any prince could be so charming or so handsome. 40 years later, that same man had married 6 women and beheaded 2 of them. He had broken his entire country away from the Pope in Rome. He had torn down nearly 1,000 monasteries, and he had sent some of his closest friends to die on the executioner's block. This is the story of how Henry VIII went from the most promising king in Europe to one of the most feared rulers England ever produced. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep dives into history, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It really does help this channel grow. Now here is a question I want you to sit with as we begin. Imagine you are a young courtier standing inside Westminster Abbey in 1509, watching this brilliant golden king take the crown. Would you have trusted him with your life? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Most people know Henry VIII for one thing: the wives. 2 beheaded, 1 died, 1 divorced, 1 survived, and 1 set aside. There is even a little rhyme school children learn to keep them straight. But the wives are only the surface. Underneath them sits one of the most important turning points in English history, a moment when a king decided that the rules of Europe simply did not apply to him. To understand how he got there, we have to start before Henry was even born, with a family that had no real right to the throne at all. Chapter 1. The Spare. The Tudors were not supposed to be kings. For most of the 1400s, England had been tearing itself apart in a long series of civil wars we now call the Wars of the Roses. 2 branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, fought each other for the crown for decades. Kings were crowned, then killed. Armies marched, then scattered. By the time the dust began to settle, the old royal bloodlines had nearly destroyed themselves. Into that gap stepped a man named Henry Tudor. His claim to the throne was thin, traced through his mother from an old Lancastrian line that had once been barred from the succession. On paper, he should never have ruled, but in 1485, he gambled everything on a single battle. At Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor faced the reigning king, Richard III. Richard was killed in the fighting, the last English king ever to die in battle. The crown, according to legend, was found in the chaos and placed on Henry Tudor's head right there on the field. He became Henry VII, the first Tudor king. To strengthen his shaky claim, the new king married Elizabeth of York, joining the 2 warring houses together at last. It was a marriage meant to heal the country, and it produced children who would carry the family forward. Their first son was named Arthur, after the legendary king. He was the great hope of the dynasty, raised from birth to rule. Then, on the 28th of June, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, a second son arrived. They named him Henry. This second boy was the spare. Nobody expected him to become king. Arthur was the heir, the future, the one who mattered for the succession. Henry was the backup, free to be groomed for a quieter life. There was even talk that the young Henry might one day enter the church and rise to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. So, while Arthur was sent away to learn the hard business of kingship, Henry stayed closer to his mother and his sisters. He was given a superb education. He studied Latin, French, theology, and music. He grew into a confident, clever, physically gifted boy who loved attention and was very good at getting it. And then, in the spring of 1502, everything changed. Chapter 2. A Dead Brother and a Spanish Bride. Arthur had recently married. His bride was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the powerful rulers who had united Spain and funded the voyages of Christopher Columbus. The marriage was a major diplomatic prize for the young Tudor dynasty. It tied England to one of the greatest powers in Europe. Catherine was intelligent, devout, and well-trained for the role of queen. She and Arthur were sent to live at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, where Arthur was learning to govern. They had been married only a few months when both of them fell seriously ill, most likely from a sweating sickness that swept through the region. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. In April of 1502, the heir to the English throne died at the age of 15. The death shattered the royal family. Henry VII and his wife were devastated, and the careful plans for the succession collapsed overnight. Suddenly, the spare was the heir. The 10-year-old Henry, who had been raised for a life out of the spotlight, was now the future king of England. But Arthur's death created another problem. Catherine of Aragon was now a widow, stranded in a foreign country, and the valuable Spanish alliance was at risk. Her parents had paid a large dowry, and they wanted the marriage connection to hold, so a new plan took shape. Catherine would marry the new heir instead. She would marry Henry. There was one obvious obstacle. Church law generally forbade a man from marrying his dead brother's widow. To get around it, the families applied to Rome for a special dispensation, a formal permission from the Pope to set the rule aside. The key question was whether Catherine's first marriage had been consummated, whether she and Arthur had ever truly been husband and wife in the physical sense. Catherine swore, then and for the rest of her life, that they had not. She insisted she had come to Henry as a virgin. The Pope granted the dispensation, and the path was cleared. Hold on to that detail about the dispensation and the question of the first marriage. It seems small and technical now. Decades later, it would crack England in half. For the moment, though, the marriage did not happen right away. Henry VII grew cautious. He kept Catherine waiting in a kind of limbo for years, using her as a bargaining chip while he haggled over money and politics with Spain. The young Henry was even made to publicly deny the betrothal at one point. Catherine endured years of poverty and uncertainty, unsure if she would ever be queen at all. Everything was waiting on the old king to die. Chapter 3. The Golden King. Henry VII died in April of 1509. He had been a careful, suspicious, money-hoarding ruler who had brought stability to England, but very little warmth. He left behind a full treasury and a country tired of his heavy taxes. His son took the throne as Henry VIII, and the contrast could not have been sharper. The new king was not yet 18. He was nearly 6 feet 2 inches tall, at a time when most men were far shorter. He was broad-shouldered, red-haired, and bursting with energy. He could ride, joust, hunt, wrestle, and dance for hours. He spoke several languages, composed music, argued theology with scholars, and threw himself into every pleasure the court could offer. After the grim final years of his father, England felt as though it had woken into a brighter age. One of his very first acts told everyone what kind of king he wanted to be. Within weeks of taking the throne, he finally married Catherine of Aragon. The long wait was over. The marriage was a love match as much as a political one, and the two were crowned together in a magnificent joint coronation. The young king genuinely admired his Spanish wife, and for years they were a devoted couple. To win cheap popularity, Henry also arrested 2 of his father's most hated tax collectors and had them executed. The crowds loved it. The message was clear. The cold, grasping old reign was over, and a generous, glittering new one had begun. It was not all sport and spectacle either. Henry fancied himself a true Renaissance prince, a man of the mind as well as the body. His court attracted scholars, artists, and thinkers from across Europe. The great humanist Erasmus, one of the most famous intellectuals of the age, visited England and praised the learning he found there. Henry surrounded himself with clever, educated men, debated points of theology with churchmen, read widely, and took genuine pride in his own intellect. He believed a king should be the wisest man in the room, and for a while, he very nearly was. This combination of brute physical confidence and real learning made him magnetic. People did not just respect Henry in these early years, they were dazzled by him. This was the height of the early Tudor court, and it is worth pausing to picture the world Henry ruled, top to bottom. At the very top sat the king and the high nobility, a small group of dukes, earls, and great lords who owned vast estates and wore the richest fabrics money could buy. Tudor England had laws, called sumptuary laws, that actually controlled who was allowed to wear what. The deepest purple and certain furs like ermine were reserved for royalty and the highest ranks. Cloth of gold and silk shimmered on the bodies of the elite, sending an instant signal of status to anyone who saw them. Below the nobility came the gentry, the landowning families who ran the counties, served as local officials, and supplied the lawyers, soldiers, and courtiers who kept the kingdom running. Below them sat the yeomen, prosperous farmers who owned or rented decent land, and the craftsmen and merchants of the towns. At the bottom, and by far the largest group, were the laborers, servants, and the poor, who worked the fields, served in great houses, and lived close to the edge of hunger. What people ate marked their place just as clearly as what they wore. The rich dined on enormous quantities of meat, roast beef, venison, swan, peacock, and spiced dishes washed down with wine. The poor ate bread, cheese, and a thick vegetable stew called pottage, day after day, with meat as a rare luxury. Sugar was so expensive that having blackened, rotting teeth could actually be a sign of wealth, because only the rich could afford to ruin their teeth that way. Daily life ran to the rhythm of the church and the seasons. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Feast days, market days, and religious processions broke up the year, and the parish church stood at the center of nearly every community. That last detail matters enormously, because the man at the top of this world was about to reach down and tear that religious life apart. Here is something to keep in mind about that glittering young king. There is a popular story that Henry wrote the famous song Greensleeves for Anne Boleyn. It is a lovely story, and it is almost certainly false. The musical style of the song points to a later period, after Henry was dead. He did write real music, though, including a piece called Pastime with Good Company that was genuinely popular in his own day. For now, the young king wanted what young kings have always wanted. He wanted glory, and glory, in the 16th century, meant war. Chapter 4. War, Glory, and the Rise of Wolsey. Henry looked across the Channel at France and saw the chance to revive the old dream of English kings, the conquest of French territory. His ancestors had won famous victories there. He wanted his own. In 1513, he led an army into France in person. The campaign produced a battle that was almost comic in how easy it was. At the so-called Battle of the Spurs, the French cavalry took one look at the advancing English and imperial forces and fled so quickly that the engagement was named for the spurs they used to gallop away. Henry captured a couple of towns and came home feeling like a conqueror, even though the gains were modest. While Henry was away chasing glory in France, a far more serious threat appeared at home. The Scots, allied with France, invaded northern England. Catherine of Aragon, left in charge as regent, helped rally the defense. The two armies met at Flodden, and the result was a catastrophe for Scotland. The Scottish king, James IV, was killed along with much of his nobility. It was one of the bloodiest defeats in Scottish history, and it happened while Henry was overseas. Out of these years rose the man who would dominate the first half of Henry's reign. His name was Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was not born to power. He was the son of a butcher or cattle dealer from Ipswich, a commoner who climbed through the church by sheer ability. He was brilliant, tireless, and gifted at organization. He made himself indispensable to the young king by handling the exhausting details of government that Henry found boring. Henry wanted to hunt, joust, and enjoy himself. Wolsey was happy to run the country. His rise was astonishing. He became a cardinal, then Lord Chancellor, the highest office in the land. For years he was effectively the most powerful man in England after the king himself. He grew fabulously rich, built the magnificent palace of Hampton Court, and lived like a prince. Many resented him, especially the old noble families who hated taking orders from a butcher's son. But as long as he delivered results and kept the king happy, Wolsey was untouchable. Henry trusted him to manage everything, including England's place among the great powers of Europe. And in 1520, Wolsey arranged the most dazzling diplomatic show the age had ever seen. Chapter 5. The Field of Cloth of Gold. By the 1520s, the politics of Europe revolved around three young, ambitious rulers. There was Henry in England. There was Francis I, the dashing King of France. And there was Charles V, who ruled Spain and much of Central Europe as the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Christendom. England was the smallest of the three, which meant Henry's friendship could tip the balance between the other two. Wolsey staged a summit to seal a friendship between Henry and Francis. It took place near Calais, in English-held territory in France, and the spectacle was so extravagant that it earned its own name, the Field of Cloth of Gold. For roughly 2.5 weeks in June of 1520, the two kings and their enormous entourages competed to outshine each other. Temporary palaces were built, fountains ran with wine. Tents were made of literal cloth of gold, the precious fabric that gave the event its name. There were jousts, feasts, music, and wrestling matches. At one point, Henry challenged Francis to a wrestling match on the spot, and the French king threw him to the ground, a humiliation Henry did not enjoy. The whole affair cost a fortune and accomplished very little in lasting terms. Within a couple of years, the friendship had cooled and the alliances had shifted again. But it remains one of the most famous images of Renaissance kingship, two glittering young monarchs trying to dazzle each other into submission. Around this same period, England got its first real glimpse of a darker side to the charming young king. The richest and grandest nobleman in the country was Edward Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. He had royal blood of his own and a sprawling network of land and power, and he had a habit of grumbling about the king and about the low-born Wolsey, who now ran everything. That grumbling, combined with loose talk that could be twisted into a claim on the throne, was enough. In 1521, Buckingham was arrested, tried by his fellow nobles, and beheaded. The charges were flimsy, built largely on the reports of disgruntled servants. The lesson, though, was sharp. Even the highest-born man in England could be destroyed if the king came to see him as a threat. It was an early sign of what Henry was capable of, years before the executions that would define his reputation. Around this same period, Henry took on a role that would become deeply ironic. When the German monk Martin Luther began challenging the authority of the Pope and launching what became the Protestant Reformation, Henry wrote a book defending the traditional Catholic faith and the authority of Rome. A grateful Pope rewarded him with a special title, Defender of the Faith. Henry was proud of it. He saw himself as a loyal son of the Church and an enemy of heresy. Remember that title, Defender of the Faith. Within little more than a decade, the same king would defy the very Pope who gave it to him and break England away from the Church he had defended. What changed everything was not theology. It was the bedroom, the nursery, and a single, growing obsession. Henry needed a son. Chapter 6. The Problem of the Heir. For all his power, Henry faced a problem he could not command his way out of. He had no male heir. Catherine of Aragon had gone through pregnancy after pregnancy, and the results were heartbreaking. There were miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who lived only days or weeks. A baby son who survived a few weeks in 1511 was celebrated across the country, then died, plunging the court into grief. Out of all those pregnancies, only one child lived and thrived. That child was a girl named Mary, born in 1516. Henry was fond of his daughter, but in his mind and in the thinking of the age, a daughter was not enough. England had never had a successful ruling queen in her own right. The one previous attempt, centuries earlier, had collapsed into civil war. Henry was convinced that if he died, leaving only a daughter, his dynasty would fall apart and the country would slide back into the chaos his father had ended at Bosworth. He needed a son to secure everything the Tudors had built. By the mid-1520s, it was becoming brutally clear that Catherine, now in her 40s, was not going to give him one. She had grown older, more pious, and physically worn down by her many pregnancies. The marriage that had once been a love match settled into something colder. Henry began to look for other explanations. He had already fathered at least one healthy, illegitimate son. In 1519, a young woman at court named Elizabeth Blount, often called Bessie, gave birth to a boy. Henry acknowledged the child openly, named him Henry Fitzroy, and eventually loaded him with grand titles, making him Duke of Richmond. The boy's existence proved something important to Henry. The failure to produce a healthy son was not his fault. He could father sons. The problem, he decided, must lie with the marriage itself. And here he reached back to that old, technical detail. The marriage to Catherine had only been possible because of a papal dispensation, the special permission to marry his dead brother's widow. What if that dispensation had been a mistake? What if marrying Arthur's widow had been a sin all along, a sin against the law of God that no pope had the power to excuse? Henry found a passage in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, that seemed to warn against marrying a brother's wife and threatened childlessness as a punishment. To Henry, this was not just a convenient excuse. He came to believe it sincerely. He decided that his marriage was cursed, that God was punishing him with dead sons for breaking divine law, and that the absence of a male heir was the proof. He convinced himself that his marriage had never been valid in the eyes of God. All he needed was for the Pope to agree, declare the marriage null, and set him free. He expected it to be quick. Popes granted annulments to kings all the time. He had no idea he was about to start a fight that would last for years and change the religious map of Europe forever. And he had just met the woman who would become the center of it all. Chapter 7. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn did not fit the mold of a typical royal bride. She came from an ambitious gentry family on the rise. Her father was a skilled diplomat, and Anne had spent years being educated at the sophisticated courts of Europe, especially in France. She returned to England, polished, witty, fashionable, and fluent in the games of court life. She was not considered a conventional beauty by the standards of the day, but she had dark eyes, charm, intelligence, and a confidence that drew people to her. Henry had already had a relationship with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn. But Anne was different. When the king turned his attention to her, she refused to simply become his mistress. She held him at arm's length, declining to give in. Whether this was cold calculation, genuine principle, or some mix of both, it had a powerful effect. The more she resisted, the more obsessed Henry became. We know how intense this obsession grew because some of Henry's love letters to Anne survive. This is striking, because Henry hated writing letters by hand. Yet he poured out page after page to her, declaring his devotion and begging for some sign of her affection. The most powerful man in England was reduced to the desperate, pleading tone of a lovesick suitor. The courtship was nearly cut short by something far beyond anyone's control. In 1528, a terrifying epidemic known as the sweating sickness swept through England. It could kill a healthy person within hours, and it struck rich and poor alike. Anne herself caught it and fell dangerously ill. Henry's reaction revealed a great deal about him. He was genuinely frightened of disease, almost to the point of obsession, and he immediately fled. moving from house to house to avoid infection and breaking up his household to limit contact. He sent Anne his own physician and anxious letters, but he would not go near her. Anne recovered. But the episode showed a side of the king that his subjects rarely saw. A man whose courage on the jousting field did not extend to the sick room. Anne, for her part, seems to have understood that she held a winning hand. She would not be a passing mistress like her sister. She wanted to be queen. And Henry, increasingly convinced that his marriage to Catherine was no marriage at all, began to imagine the same thing. Anne could give him the legitimate son he craved. All that stood in the way was the small matter of his existing wife and the Pope in Rome. So began the long, grinding effort that contemporaries called the King's Great Matter. The plan was simple in theory. Henry would ask the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine on the grounds that it had never been lawful. Then he would marry Anne, father a son, and secure the succession. Wolsey, the great fixer, was put in charge of making it happen. It should have worked. It did not. And the reason had almost nothing to do with England. Chapter 8. The Great Matter and the Fall of Wolsey. The Pope at this time was Clement VII, and he was in an impossible position. The man Henry needed to push aside, Catherine of Aragon, was not just any abandoned wife. She was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe. And in 1527, the troops of that very emperor had stormed and brutally sacked the city of Rome itself. The Pope was effectively at the emperor's mercy. He was in no position to insult Charles by declaring his beloved aunt a discarded mistress whose daughter was illegitimate. So Clement did what frightened men in power often do. He stalled. He delayed. He appointed commissions, demanded more evidence, and dragged the case out year after year, hoping the whole problem would somehow resolve itself. Catherine, meanwhile, fought back with quiet, unshakable dignity. She flatly denied that her marriage to Arthur had ever been consummated, which knocked out the legal foundation of Henry's whole argument. At one dramatic hearing in England, she rose, crossed the room, knelt at Henry's feet in front of everyone, and begged him as her husband and her king not to cast her aside after years of loyalty. Then she walked out and refused to recognize the court's authority at all. It was a masterclass in resistance, and it left Henry humiliated and furious. There was also resentment that had been building for years over money. Henry's wars and his lavish lifestyle were enormously expensive, and it fell to Wolsey to squeeze the country for funds. In 1525, Wolsey tried to impose a heavy new tax, demanded without the consent of Parliament, that became known as the Amicable Grant. It was anything but amicable. The tax was so unpopular that it sparked open resistance and the beginnings of revolt, and Henry was forced to back down and cancel it. True to form, the king let Wolsey absorb the blame for the whole disaster, publicly pretending he had known nothing about it. It was a preview of how Henry treated his servants when their usefulness ran into trouble. The credit was always the king's. The blame always belonged to someone else. The years dragged on with no result, and Henry's patience ran out. Someone had to take the blame for the failure, and that someone was Wolsey. The cardinal had promised to deliver an annulment and had failed. Anne Boleyn and her allies, who saw Wolsey as an enemy, pushed hard against him. In 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his offices and his property. The butcher's son, who had ruled England for years, fell from the heights in a matter of weeks. He was ordered to come south to face charges that would almost certainly have ended at the executioner's block. But on the journey, broken in health and spirit, Thomas Wolsey fell ill and died. He was said to have remarked near the end that if he had served God as diligently as he had served the king, God would not have abandoned him in his old age. He had escaped the axe only by dying first. With Wolsey gone, Henry needed new men, men who could find a way to get him what the Pope would not give. two figures rose to fill the gap, and together they would carry out one of the most dramatic transformations in English history. Chapter 9: Cromwell, Cranmer, and the Break with Rome. The first of these new men was Thomas Cromwell. Like Wolsey, Cromwell came from nothing. He was the son of a Putney blacksmith and brewer, a rough, self-made man who had been a soldier, a merchant, and a lawyer before entering royal service. He was ruthlessly efficient, a genius at administration and law, and utterly loyal to the goal of getting things done. Where others saw an impossible religious deadlock, Cromwell saw a legal and political problem with a solution. His idea was breathtaking in its boldness. If the Pope would not grant the annulment, then England would simply stop recognizing the Pope's authority at all. The king, not the Pope, would become the supreme head of the Church in England. With that single move, the entire problem disappeared. An English church under English control could grant the king whatever he wanted. The second man was Thomas Cranmer, a thoughtful scholar with quiet reforming sympathies. Henry had him appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest churchman in England. Cranmer could provide the religious authority to do what Rome refused. The machinery moved quickly. By early 1533, Anne Boleyn was pregnant, which made speed essential, because any son had to be born inside a lawful marriage to count as the heir. Henry secretly married Anne. Then a new law, the Act and Restraint of Appeals, declared that legal cases in England could no longer be appealed to Rome, cutting off the Pope's ability to interfere. Cranmer, acting as head of the English Church, formally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and his marriage to Anne valid. What made Cromwell's revolution so durable was the way he carried it out. He did not simply have the king issue royal commands. He worked through Parliament, passing a long series of laws over several years in what later became known as the Reformation Parliament. By dressing the break with Rome in the language of statute and law, Cromwell gave it the appearance of the whole nation acting together, not just the will of one man. It bound the political class to the changes and made them far harder to undo. Henry was not just declaring himself head of the church, he was having the law of England declare it for him, which made defiance not merely disloyal, but illegal. In June of 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony, visibly pregnant with the child everyone hoped would be a son. The following year, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. It declared the king to be the supreme head of the Church of England on earth. The break with Rome was complete. After 1,000 years of English Christianity answering to the Pope, the King of England now answered to no one in matters of faith. He held both crown and church in his own hands. This was an earthquake, and earthquakes leave victims. Chapter 10: The Price of Defiance. The break with Rome forced every important person in England to make a choice. A new oath was demanded, requiring people to accept Henry as head of the church and to recognize his marriage to Anne and the children it would produce. To refuse was treason, and treason meant death. Most people swallowed their doubts and took the oath. A few could not. The most famous of these was Sir Thomas More. More had been one of the most respected men in Europe, a brilliant scholar, author of the book Utopia, a devout Catholic, and for a time Henry's own Lord Chancellor, the successor to Wolsey. He had also been a genuine friend of the king, but More could not accept that the king had replaced the Pope as head of the church. He did not loudly protest. He simply refused to take the oath and stayed silent, hoping his silence would protect him. It did not. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, tried on questionable evidence, and condemned to death. In 1535, Thomas More was beheaded. Before he died, he reportedly said that he died the king's good servant, but God's first. A bishop named John Fisher, who had also refused the oath, was executed around the same time. The message to all of England was unmistakable. There would be no exceptions. no matter how respected or beloved a man might be. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had started all of this simply by refusing to step aside, lived out her final years in cold isolation. She was separated from her daughter Mary, stripped of her title as queen, and confined to damp, remote houses. She never stopped insisting that she was Henry's true and only wife. She died in early 1536, still defiant, still loyal to a husband who had abandoned her. When the news reached court, Henry and Anne reportedly celebrated by dressing in bright yellow. The cruelty reached into the royal family itself. Henry's daughter Mary, once the cherished heir, was now declared illegitimate, since her parents' marriage had been ruled invalid. She was stripped of her title of princess and separated from her mother, forbidden even to see Catherine as she lay dying. For a time, the teenage Mary was sent to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, a deliberate humiliation. She was pressured relentlessly to sign documents admitting that her mother's marriage had been unlawful and that she herself was a bastard. For years, she refused, clinging to her faith and her mother's memory, until the pressure and fear finally wore her down. The girl who had once been the future of the dynasty was now an outcast in her own father's kingdom. But Cromwell was not finished reshaping England. The break with Rome had opened a door, and behind that door lay an enormous prize: the wealth of the church itself. Chapter 11. The Dissolution of the Monasteries. For centuries, monasteries had been woven into the fabric of English life. There were hundreds of them across the country, home to monks and nuns. They owned vast tracts of land, perhaps a fifth or more of all the land in England. They ran schools, cared for the sick, sheltered travelers, and gave to the poor. They were also, in the eyes of reformers, often corrupt, lazy, and far too rich. Cromwell saw both an opportunity and a justification. He sent officials around the country to inspect the monasteries and report on their conduct. The reports came back full of accusations of laziness, immorality, and fraud. Some of it true, and some of it exaggerated to build a case. Armed with these findings, the Crown began shutting the monasteries down, first the smaller ones, then the great houses as well. This is what we call the dissolution of the monasteries, and it was one of the largest transfers of wealth and property in English history. Monastic lands and treasures flowed into the king's hands. Gold and silver were melted down. Libraries were scattered or destroyed. Lead was stripped from roofs, and great abbeys that had stood for centuries were left as the roofless ruins that still dot the English landscape today. Much of the seized land was then sold off to nobles and gentry, which had a clever political effect. It gave a whole class of powerful families a direct financial stake in making sure the changes were never reversed. For the king, it was a windfall. For ordinary people in many regions, especially in the more traditional north, it was a disaster and an outrage. The monasteries had been a source of charity, employment, and spiritual comfort, and now they were being torn down by the king's men. Not every change was about money and destruction. One reform from these years would outlast everything else. Under Cromwell's direction, an official English translation of the Bible, known as the Great Bible, was produced and ordered to be placed in every parish church in the land. For the first time, ordinary English people could hear the scriptures read aloud in their own language, rather than in Latin, which almost none of them understood. It was a quiet revolution in its own right. Once people could read or hear the Bible for themselves, the church could never fully control how they understood it again. Henry approved it as a way to strengthen his own authority over religion, but the long-term effects ran far beyond anything he intended. In 1536, that anger exploded into the largest rebellion of Henry's entire reign. It was called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Tens of thousands of people in the north of England rose up, demanding an end to the religious changes and the restoration of the monasteries. For a moment, it was a genuine threat to the throne. Henry handled it with cold cunning, He made promises, offered pardons, and persuaded the rebels to disperse peacefully. Then, once they had laid down their arms and gone home, he broke his word. The leaders were rounded up and executed, some 200 or more people put to death as a warning. The lesson was savage and clear. You did not defy Henry VIII and live. While the king was crushing rebellion in the north, his personal life was lurching toward yet another crisis. Because by this point, the woman he had torn his country apart to marry had already fallen. Chapter 12. The Fall of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn's triumph did not last. The whole purpose of the marriage had been a son, but when Anne gave birth in September of 1533, the child was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. It is one of the great ironies of history that this daughter, treated at the time as a bitter disappointment, would grow up to become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest rulers England would ever have. But in the moment, she was not the son Henry needed. Anne's position depended entirely on producing a male heir, and she could not. She suffered miscarriages, including one of a male child early in 1536, which seems to have been the turning point. Henry began to wonder whether this marriage, too, was cursed. His passionate obsession with Anne had cooled into irritation. She was sharp-tongued, proud, and made enemies easily. And now she was failing at the one task that justified her existence in his eyes. Worse, his eye had already begun to wander toward one of her own ladies-in-waiting, a quiet young woman named Jane Seymour. Once Henry decided he wanted to be free of Anne, the machinery turned against her with terrifying speed. Cromwell, who had clashed with Anne and now found her in the way, assembled the case. Anne was accused of adultery with several men, including a court musician and even her own brother, along with a charge of plotting the king's death. The evidence was thin to non-existent, built on rumor, coerced statements, and the sheer need to find her guilty. By modern standards, and by the standards of many at the time, the charges were almost certainly false. It did not matter. The men accused with her were condemned and executed. Then Anne herself was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. In May of 1536, less than 3 years after her grand coronation, Anne Boleyn was beheaded inside the Tower of London. As a small mercy, Henry arranged for a skilled swordsman to be brought over from France to carry out the execution with a blade rather than the usual axe. The woman for whom Henry had broken with the Pope, defied an emperor, and remade the English Church was dead, executed on his orders, and he wasted no time. Within days, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Chapter 13. Jane Seymour and the longed-for son. Jane Seymour was, in many ways, the opposite of Anne Boleyn. Where Anne had been dazzling, outspoken, and combative, Jane was gentle, quiet, and modest, or at least she presented herself that way. Her family motto was bound up with the idea of obedience, and she played the role of the calm, submissive wife that Henry now craved after years of storms. Henry married her in 1536, only days after Anne's execution, with almost no public ceremony. Jane also did something the king valued above all else. She tried to heal the wounds in his family. She gently encouraged Henry toward a reconciliation with his daughter Mary, who had been treated harshly during Anne's time and pressured to deny her own legitimacy. For a brief period, the royal household had something close to peace. Here is a small but telling detail about life at Henry's court. One of the most prized positions a courtier could hold was the post of groom of the stool. The duties involved attending the king at his most private moments, including helping him on the toilet. It sounds humiliating to modern ears, but it was actually one of the most coveted jobs at court. The man who held it had constant, intimate access to the king, and access to the king meant power and influence that other nobles could only envy. In October of 1537, Jane Seymour finally gave Henry what 3 wives and decades of effort had failed to produce: a healthy son. The boy was named Edward, and his birth set off wild celebrations across the kingdom. Bonfires were lit, bells were rung, and cannons were fired. After all the death and upheaval, the dynasty finally had its male heir. Henry was overjoyed. Then, just days after the birth, the joy turned to grief. Jane fell ill, almost certainly from complications of the difficult delivery, and within about 2 weeks, she was dead. Henry was genuinely devastated. Of all his wives, Jane was the one he seemed to mourn most deeply, partly because she had given him a son, and partly because she had died before he could grow tired of her. He wore black for an extended period, an unusual gesture for him. Years later, he would arrange to be buried beside her. For all his ruthlessness toward the living, it was Jane Seymour he chose to lie next to in death. But a king could not stay a widower forever, and the search for the next queen began. This time, it would not be a love match or a court romance. It would be cold international politics, and it would go badly wrong. Chapter 14: Anne of Cleves and the Fall of Cromwell. By the late 1530s, Henry was no longer the golden young king of his accession. He was middle-aged, increasingly heavy, and suffering. Years earlier, in early 1536, he had taken a catastrophic fall in a jousting accident. His fully armored horse had come down on top of him, and he lay unconscious for around 2 hours. Many around him feared he was dead. He survived, but some historians believe that day marked a turning point. The injury seems to have aggravated a wound on his leg that became a chronic, ulcerated sore that never properly healed and caused him agony for the rest of his life. There is even a theory that the head injury itself altered his personality, making the once charming king more volatile, more suspicious, and more cruel. Whether or not the accident changed his brain, it certainly broke his body. The athlete who had once dominated the tournament field would never joust again. From this point on, he grew enormously overweight, and the constant pain only sharpened his temper. Here is just how much his body had changed. A suit of armor made for Henry late in his life shows a waist measurement of around 52 inches. The slim, towering young man who once outjousted the whole court had grown into someone who had to be moved around his palaces with the help of mechanical devices. His chief minister Cromwell, still searching for political advantage, arranged a foreign marriage to strengthen England's hand against its Catholic enemies. The bride chosen was Anne of Cleves, a noblewoman from a Protestant-leaning German duchy. The match would tie England to useful allies on the continent. There was just one problem. Henry had never met her. To help the king decide, the famous painter Hans Holbein was sent to paint Anne's portrait. Holbein produced a flattering image, and based on it, Henry agreed to the marriage. When Anne finally arrived in England in late 1539, the king, ever the romantic, decided to surprise her in disguise before the official meeting. The encounter was a disaster. Anne, who had no idea who this large stranger was unimpressed, and Henry was wounded in his pride. He took an instant dislike to her, complaining bitterly that she did not match the portrait and that he found her unattractive. The marriage went ahead in early 1540 anyway, for political reasons, but Henry refused to make it a real marriage, and the union was never consummated. Within months, he wanted out. The political situation had shifted, the alliance was no longer needed, and Henry simply did not want her. Getting free this time was almost easy. The marriage was annulled on the grounds that it had never been consummated and that Anne had a prior betrothal. Anne, sensibly, did not fight it. She agreed quietly and was rewarded handsomely. She was given houses, a generous income, and an honored status as the king's beloved sister. She outlived Henry and all his other wives and lived comfortably for years. Of the 6, she may well have gotten the best deal of all. It is worth understanding what Henry actually believed by this point, because it surprises a lot of people. Breaking with the Pope had never made Henry a Protestant. In matters of doctrine, he remained deeply conservative, still attached to most traditional Catholic beliefs. In 1539, he made this crystal clear by pushing through a law known as the Six Articles, which reaffirmed core Catholic teachings and made denying them a serious crime. The result was a religious policy that looks bizarre from the outside. Henry executed Catholics who refused to accept him as head of the Church, and he executed Protestants who rejected traditional doctrine, sometimes around the same time. He had built a church that answered only to himself, conservative in its beliefs but utterly loyal to the crown. This conservative turn also put men like Cromwell, who leaned toward reform, in growing danger, as the religious tide at court shifted against them. Someone, however, had to pay for the embarrassing failure of the marriage, and that someone was Thomas Cromwell. He had arranged the match, and his many enemies among the old nobility seized the moment to destroy him. He was arrested, accused of treason and heresy, and condemned without a proper trial. In July of 1540, the blacksmith's son, who had engineered the break with Rome and reshaped the English state, was beheaded on his master's orders, just as Wolsey had nearly been, and more had been before him. Henry later regretted it, complaining that he had been tricked into killing the best servant he ever had. The regret came too late to matter, and on the very same day that Cromwell died, Henry married again. Chapter 15. Catherine Howard. The new queen was Catherine Howard, and she was barely more than a teenager. She was a young cousin of Anne Boleyn, from the powerful Howard family, and she had caught the eye of the aging, ailing king. To Henry, she was a burst of youth and energy at a time when his own body was failing him. He doted on her, showered her with gifts and affection, and called her his rose without a thorn. For a man in constant pain and growing old, she was a tonic. The trouble was the gap between them. Henry was approaching 50, sick and enormous. Catherine was young, lively, and surrounded by attractive young men at court. She also had a past. Before her marriage, she had been involved romantically with at least one or two young men, including a music teacher and a man named Francis Derham. In the tense, gossip-soaked world of the Tudor court, secrets like that did not stay buried. After her marriage to the king, Catherine appears to have grown close to a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper, and the two seem to have arranged secret meetings, helped along by one of her ladies. Whether the relationship was fully physical or not, it was reckless beyond belief. To be unfaithful to the king, or even to give the appearance of it, was to gamble with your life. When word of her past relationships and her present behavior reached Archbishop Cranmer, he faced the unenviable task of telling the king. Henry at first refused to believe it. He had been genuinely happy with her, perhaps happier than with any wife since Jane. But as the evidence mounted and confessions were extracted, denial gave way to fury and then to grief. The men involved were arrested and executed. Catherine Howard's end came in February of 1542. She was beheaded inside the Tower of London, on the same ground where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. She was likely still in her late teens. 2 of Henry's 6 wives had now gone to the block, both of them young women he had once been infatuated with. The brutality of these final years was not aimed only at his wives. Henry had grown deeply paranoid about anyone with royal blood who might one day challenge his line. His suspicion fell on the Pole family, descendants of the old Yorkist kings who had ruled before the Tudors. One of them, a cardinal living safely abroad, had publicly attacked Henry's break with Rome, and the king could not reach him, so he reached the family instead. Several members were arrested and executed on charges of treason. The most shocking case was Margaret Pole, the elderly Countess of Salisbury, a woman in her late 60s who had once been close to the royal family and had served as governess to Princess Mary. She was held in the Tower for years and then executed in 1541. By some accounts, the execution was horribly botched by an inexperienced headsman. Her only real crime was the blood in her veins. Henry, by now, was a broken and bitter man. The betrayal seemed to age him further. He withdrew, brooded, and grew even more difficult. It seemed unlikely he would marry again at all. But he had one wife left to take, and she would be the one to outlast him. Chapter 16. Catherine Parr and the End of the King. The sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr. She was different from the others, an intelligent, mature, twice-widowed woman with a sharp mind and strong religious convictions. She was not a frightened girl or a foreign bride. She was a capable adult who understood exactly what she was walking into. By some accounts, she had actually been in love with someone else, Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Jane. But when the king made his wishes known, refusing was not really an option. She married Henry in 1543. Catherine Parr became as much a nurse and companion as a wife. By now, Henry was a sick, immense, often immobile man whose ulcerated leg gave off such a foul smell that it could reportedly be detected before he entered a room. Catherine cared for him, soothed his temper, and brought a measure of stability to the royal household in his final years. She also worked to reunite the family, helping to bring his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and the young Edward, back into the line of succession together. She was a serious thinker who leaned toward the new Protestant ideas, and she even published her own religious writings, a remarkable thing for a woman in that era. But her strong opinions nearly destroyed her. Her religious enemies at court tried to turn the king against her, and at one point a warrant for her arrest was actually drawn up. Catherine survived by being clever. When confronted, she insisted that she had only ever argued religion with him to distract him from his pain and to learn from his superior wisdom, not to instruct him. Flattered and reassured, Henry forgave her. She had talked her way off the executioner's block, something few of his wives or ministers had managed. In his last years, Henry was still capable of one more burst of his old ambitions. He went to war with France again and personally oversaw the capture of the town of Boulogne. He waged a brutal campaign against Scotland that became known as the Rough Wooing, an attempt to force a marriage between his son Edward and the infant Scottish queen, Mary. And in 1545, during a confrontation with a French fleet, his great warship the Mary Rose suddenly sank in the waters off Portsmouth, taking hundreds of men down with her. In full view of the king, these were costly, draining ventures that emptied the treasury his father had so carefully filled. To pay for it all, Henry resorted to a desperate trick. He debased the coinage, ordering the royal mints to mix cheaper metals into the gold and silver coins so that more money could be produced from the same amount of precious metal. In the short term, it gave him cash. In the long term, it wrecked confidence in English money and helped drive up prices, leaving a legacy of inflation that ordinary people would feel for years. The glittering Golden King had become an old man spending recklessly on wars he could not win, propped up by money that was worth less every year. By the start of 1547, Henry was dying. His vast body was failing, and his attendants were too frightened to tell him the truth, because predicting the death of the king was itself a crime. On the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. He had reigned for nearly 38 years. As he had wished, he was buried at Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his son. Chapter 17. The Long Shadow. Henry had tried to control everything, even from beyond the grave. In his final months, he laid out detailed instructions for what should happen after his death. Because Edward was only a child, the king arranged for a council of nobles to govern on the boy's behalf until he came of age. He carefully fixed the order of succession in law, placing Edward first, then Mary, then Elizabeth, restoring both daughters to the line even though he had once declared them illegitimate. But the careful balance he designed did not survive long. The men he left in charge quickly began scheming against one another for power. The Seymour family, the relatives of Jane and uncles of the young king, pushed their way to the top, and one of them, Thomas Seymour, even married the widowed Catherine Parr shortly after Henry's death, the man she had loved before the king ever claimed her. The tightly controlled order Henry had imagined dissolved into a scramble almost as soon as he was gone. The crown passed to the son Henry had moved heaven and earth to produce. The boy became Edward VI, a king at the age of 9. But the great prize, the male heir Henry, had broken his marriage, his church, and so many lives to secure, did not last. Edward was sickly, and he died as a teenager, having reigned only a few years and leaving no children of his own. The fragile dynasty Henry had been so desperate to protect was once again hanging by a thread. What followed proved that Henry's obsession had been, in a sense, pointed in the wrong direction. After Edward came his eldest daughter Mary, the child of Catherine of Aragon. As Mary I, she tried to drag England back to the Catholic faith and burned hundreds of Protestants in the attempt, earning a grim nickname. Her reign was short and troubled, and she too died without an heir. And then came the daughter nobody had wanted. Elizabeth, the child of Anne Boleyn, whose birth had been treated as a failure, took the throne as Elizabeth I. She ruled for nearly 45 years. She steadied the country, defeated the Spanish Armada, presided over a golden age of English culture, and became one of the most celebrated monarchs in the nation's history. The daughter Henry had been so disappointed by, turned out to be the great Tudor ruler he had always wanted, and she did it without the son he thought he needed. Henry's deepest legacy was not his bloodline, which died out with Elizabeth, who never married and left no children. His real legacy was the break with Rome. By making himself head of the church, Henry had permanently changed England's relationship with religion and with Europe. The Church of England that exists today traces its origins directly to one man's determination to end one marriage and begin another. The monasteries he tore down never came back. The wealth he seized reshaped who held power in England for generations. He had set out simply to secure a son and a stable succession. Instead, almost by accident, he had launched a religious and political revolution whose effects would outlast his family, his century, and his entire world. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you now know more about the Tudors than almost anyone you will meet. There is another video already waiting on screen for you right now, so go ahead and let that one play next. And if this was worth the time, a quick subscribe tells me to keep making history videos like this. Thanks for watching.